They said no human could survive what the Baron planned that day. Not against 6 aggressive bulls, animals bred to kill. Not to hesitate. The iron gate slammed shut. Dust rose from the ground, and inside the enclosure stood one enslaved man, alone, unarmed and already condemned. This was not punishment. It was entertainment. A cruel experiment designed to prove that a slave's life was worth less than the beasts surrounding him. Witnesses expected blood. They expected screams. They expected a body dragged across the dirt, but what happened next shattered every rule of fear, power, and survival. Because when the gates finally opened, the man did not come out broken. He walked out with every single bull following him, calm, obedient, transformed. Tonight we uncover the forgotten story of the Baron who tried to make a monster, and the enslaved man who walked out as something far more dangerous to the system that enslaved him. The Baron's name was spoken carefully, never casually, and never without a pause that carried fear inside it. On the estates he controlled, his reputation traveled faster than his horses, passing from slave quarters to nearby villages, whispered through kitchens, fields, and marketplaces. He was known not simply as a master, but as a man who believed fear was the purest form of order. Where others relied on whips or chains, he relied on spectacle. Punishment in his eyes was most effective when it was seen, remembered, and retold. He understood that terror multiplied when it had witnesses. From the beginning, the Baron cultivated cruelty as theater. He announced punishments in advance, allowing anticipation to do half the work. Slaves were forced to attend, sometimes dragged from their labor, lined up so no one could look away. He wanted their eyes open. He wanted the images burned into their mind. Mercy, he believed, bred defiance, but humiliation broke the spirit in ways pain alone could not. The Baron took pride in designing punishments that felt unpredictable, because uncertainty kept people obedient long after the wounds healed. Stories of his acts spread because they were difficult to believe. A man made to stand under the sun for days without shade, collapsing and dragged back upright. A woman forced to choose which of her children would be spared a beating, knowing the choice itself would haunt her longer than the scars. A worker accused of stealing grain, tied to a post while accusations were read aloud like a public trial with no defense, and no verdict other than suffering. These were not moments of rage. They were calculated performances, rehearsed in the Baron's mind long before they were carried out. What frightened people most was not the violence, but the calm with which he ordered it. He did not shout. He did not lose control. His voice remained measured, almost bored, as though cruelty were a routine task, no different from accounting or managing crops. That calm made resistance feel pointless. If a man could inflict pain without emotion, how could he ever be appealed to? The Baron believed that fear worked best when it felt permanent, when hope itself seemed irrational. His punishments were designed to be talked about. Survivors carried the stories, and even those who did not survive became legends, used as warnings. The Baron encouraged that. He never denied the rumors. He allowed exaggeration to grow, knowing that a reputation inflated by fear required less effort to maintain. A whispered story could do the work of 10 guards. By the time someone was accused of wrongdoing, the punishment already existed in their imagination. Public punishment days became rituals. People knew when they were coming. Labor slowed as tension filled the air. Mothers held children close. Men avoided eye contact, afraid that even looking wrong might draw attention. The Baron would arrive dressed carefully, boots polished, coat clean, as if attending a social event rather than presiding over suffering. He believed appearance mattered, that authority looked strongest when it appeared controlled and civilized, even while committing acts that stripped others of their humanity. What made his cruelty distinct was his need to escalate. Familiar punishments lost their power over time. Fear, he knew, could grow dull if not sharpened. Each new act had to surpass the last, had to introduce a new level of shock. This escalation was not driven by necessity but by vanity. The Baron wanted to be remembered. He wanted his name to mean something long after he was gone. In his mind, being feared was a form of immortality. Other landowners criticized him quietly, not out of compassion, but out of concern. Excessive brutality, they argued, invited rebellion. It disrupted productivity. It created martyrs. The Baron dismissed them all. He believed rebellion came from weakness, not oppression. If his slaves ever rose against him, he reasoned, it would only prove that fear had not been applied thoroughly enough. This belief made him dangerous, because it meant there was no limit he would not consider crossing. The Baron also understood symbolism. He chose punishments that sent messages. A strong man humiliated publicly, to warn others not to rely on strength. A trusted overseer punished to show loyalty meant nothing. He wanted every act to communicate a lesson, even if that lesson was simply that life under his rule was unpredictable and disposable. Slaves were not just labor to him, they were instruments through which he demonstrated his power to the world around him. As years passed, his estate became known less for its wealth and more for its dread. Travelers avoided it, merchants hurried their dealings, even free men felt uneasy crossing his land, knowing that cruelty practiced openly against slaves could easily spill over onto anyone deemed inconvenient. The Baron seemed to relish this isolation. Fear had replaced respect, but to him, fear was superior. By the time the incident with the bulls was conceived, the Baron's reputation had already reached its peak. Ordinary punishments no longer satisfied his desire to dominate. He wanted something unprecedented, something that would be spoken of in hushed voices, long after the witnesses were gone. He wanted to remind everyone that no boundary, moral, physical, or human, applied to him. In his mind, the enslaved man chosen for the act was not a person, but a living object meant to reinforce a legacy built entirely on terror. And as the idea formed, it felt to the Baron like the natural next step in a career defined by cruelty rather than an escalation into something irreversible, something that would test not just the limits of fear, but the illusion of absolute control he had spent a lifetime constructing, because a man who rules through terror eventually believes terror itself will always obey him, and that belief was about to be challenged in a way no punishment, no audience, and no reputation could ever fully contain or undo. Even before the gates were closed and the ground inside the enclosure was marked with deep, heavy prints left by animals that had already learned to charge rather than hesitate. Animals chosen not for symbolism but for uncontrollable force, because the Baron believed true power was proven when even nature itself was turned into a weapon under his command. He was not chosen because he was the weakest, nor because he was the strongest, but because he was inconvenient. On the Baron's estate, survival depended on invisibility, and this man had failed at that without ever intending to. He worked steadily, spoke little, and avoided conflict, yet there was something about him that unsettled the overseers. He did not panic easily. When shouted at, he listened. When threatened, he did not beg. His silence was not empty, it felt deliberate, as though his thoughts remained out of reach. Men like him were dangerous not because they resisted, but because they observed. The overseers noticed it first. They reported that he calmed other slaves without speaking, that arguments ended when he arrived, that frightened animals behaved differently around him. None of this was dramatic enough to be called defiance, but it disrupted the hierarchy built on fear. The Baron did not tolerate disruption, especially when it could not be punished directly. A man who fought back could be beaten, a man who ran could be hunted, but a man who simply endured, who remained inwardly intact, posed a subtler threat. He had been brought to the estate years earlier, sold young enough that his past had been erased by ownership, yet old enough to remember a life before captivity. That memory shaped him, while others learned submission as a survival tactic. He learned patience. He understood patterns, the rhythm of cruelty, the moods of those in power. He learned when to lower his eyes and when to look straight ahead. He learned that fear had limits, and that those limits could be sensed, even if they could not be crossed openly. The Baron first noticed him during a routine inspection. Slaves were lined up, eyes down, bodies tense, waiting for judgment that could arrive without warning. Most trembled in ways that pleased the Baron. Fear affirmed his control, but this man stood different, not proudly, not rebelliously, just present. His breathing was steady, his posture was relaxed enough to be noticeable. The Baron paused longer than usual in front of him, searching for arrogance, for defiance, for anything that justified immediate punishment. He found none, and that absence irritated him more than open resistance would have. From that moment, the man was observed. Overseers were instructed to watch him closely, to note any sign of insubordination. None came. He worked as ordered. He accepted punishment when it was given, though it was rarely directed at him. He helped others when allowed, shared food when possible, and listened more than he spoke. Over time, people gravitated toward him instinctively, not because he promised escape or rebellion, but because his presence suggested survival without surrender. That alone made him suspicious. When the Baron began searching for someone to serve as the center of a new spectacle, he did not announce it. He believed anticipation worked best when mixed with uncertainty. The chosen victim had to meet specific criteria. The man could not be known for violence, because fear of retaliation would undermine the demonstration. He could not be broken already, because there would be no drama in destroying what was already ruined. The Baron wanted contrast. He wanted hope crushed in front of witnesses. The enslaved man fit perfectly. He was physically capable but not imposing, He had no record of rebellion. He had endured quietly, which the Baron interpreted not as strength, but as a lack of imagination. The Baron believed endurance without rebellion was simply another form of submission. He did not consider the possibility that endurance could coexist with something deeper, something untouched by punishment. The decision was made without ceremony. One morning the man was pulled from his work and separated from the others. No explanation was given. Explanations created questions, and questions created resistance. He was confined, not beaten, not threatened. The absence of immediate violence was intentional. The Baron wanted confusion to soften him before fear arrived. Isolation was used not as punishment, but as preparation. During that time rumors spread quickly. Slaves noticed his absence. They speculated in whispers, each theory worse than the last. Some believed he had been sold, others believed he had been accused of something unspeakable. The uncertainty gnawed at them, which was precisely the Baron's intention. A punishment, unseen but anticipated, could control many more people than one witnessed directly. When the man was finally brought before the Baron, the encounter was brief. No accusations were made, no crimes listed. The Baron looked at him as one might examine livestock, assessing usefulness rather than guilt. The man was told only that he had been selected for what was left unsaid, hanging in the air like a threat with no shape. The Baron enjoyed that moment, the pause where imagination did the work of terror. What the Baron did not notice was how the man listened. He did not flinch. He did not ask questions. His eyes did not dart toward exits or guard. He absorbed the words and the silence between them, measuring tone rather than content. He had learned long ago that those in power revealed more through how they spoke than through what they said. The calmness of the Baron's voice told him this was not an impulsive act, but something rehearsed, something meant to be witnessed. In the days leading up to the event, the man was fed better than usual. His wounds were left untreated but not aggravated. This was not kindness, it was practicality. The Baron wanted him alive, alert, and physically capable. A weak man mauled by animals would not impress anyone. The spectacle required the illusion of fairness, the suggestion that survival was theoretically possible even if practically unimaginable. The man understood this instinctively. He realized he was not being prepared to suffer quietly, but to perform. His life had become a symbol in someone else's narrative. That realization did not break him. It clarified things. Fear thrives on uncertainty, but clarity, even when it brings dread, can sharpen the mind. He stopped wondering why he had been chosen, and focused instead on what was being asked of him without words. On the morning of the event, as chains were placed around his wrists and guards led him across the estate, he noticed details others would have missed. The way people avoided his eye, the forced excitement in the overseer's voices, the Baron's careful positioning, elevated and visible, as though framing himself as part of the story. The man recognized the shape of a ritual meant to reinforce power, meant to end with his destruction, serving as proof that resistance, even imagined resistance, was futile. What no one understood was that the man had already survived years inside a system designed to erase it. He had learned to read danger, to listen to silence, to recognize when violence followed patterns, and when it relied on chaos. Being chosen did not make him special in the way the Baron believed. It made him a vessel for the Baron's arrogance. The Baron assumed the man would respond like everyone else had before him, with terror, with desperation, with submission, never considering that survival under cruelty sometimes produces not fear, but a different kind of awareness, one that waits quietly until it is tested. Because the Baron believed selection was an act of dominance rather than a gamble, believing that choosing a man meant owning the outcome, never imagining that the act of choosing itself could place his authority into the hands of someone he had already underestimated. The bulls were not chosen at random. Each one had a history, a record carefully noted by the men who handled them, and by the Baron himself. They were selected because they did not hesitate, because they charged first and questioned nothing. These were animals bred for dominance, raised in confinement, conditioned to respond to agitation with violence. From a young age they had been denied calm handling. Hands approached them only to provoke, to strike, to force reactions that could later be relied upon. The Baron wanted certainty, and certainty meant animals whose instincts had been shaped toward aggression rather than restraint. They were kept apart from ordinary livestock, housed in reinforced pens away from the main fields. Their presence was known even before they were seen. The ground near their enclosure was torn and uneven, churned by constant move. Fence posts leaned outward under the pressure of bodies that tested boundaries daily. Workers assigned to feed them did so quickly, cautiously, using long poles and never turning their backs. No one lingered.
No one spoke loudly. The bulls reacted to sound, to movement, to anything unfamiliar with immediate hostility. Each bull had been trained to associate humans with threat and challenge. This was not accidental. Men had been sent into the pen under supervision, protected by barriers, instructed to provoke the animals just enough to trigger rage without allowing contact. Whips cracked, shouts echoed. The bulls learned that human presence meant confrontation. Over time, the distinction between defense and attack disappeared. Any figure entering their space became an enemy by default. The Baron observed this training with interest rather than concern. To him, the bulls were instruments, not living beings. Their unpredictability was precisely what made them useful. He did not want animals that could be reasoned with or controlled by familiar handlers. He wanted creatures that responded to instinct alone, stripped of nuance. The more dangerous they became, the more valuable they were to his design. When 6 were finally selected, it was because together they represented overwhelming force. 1 bull could be avoided, 2 could be outmaneuvered, but 6 created chaos. They filled space, cut off escape routes, magnified fear through movement and noise. Their combined weight alone was enough to crush a man without intent. The Baron understood spectacle. He understood that terror multiplied when danger came from all directions at once. In the days leading up to the event, the bulls were intentionally agitated. Their feeding schedule was altered. They were kept restless, their routines disrupted. Strange men approached their enclosure at night, making noise, shining lights, ensuring sleep never came easily. The animals grew more reactive, more volatile. Even experienced handlers noticed the change and expressed concern. The Baron dismissed them. Concern was irrelevant. The bulls were meant to be dangerous, not manageable. Rumors about the bulls spread quickly. Slaves spoke of them in low voices, describing horns sharpened by use, eyes that rolled white at the slightest move. Some claimed they had killed men before, that accidents had been covered up or ignored. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories served their purpose. Fear grew larger than the animals themselves. By the time people imagined the enclosure, it existed in their minds as a place of certain death. The enclosure itself was chosen carefully. It was not a wide field where a man might run. It was confined enough to keep the bulls close, to ensure contact was unavoidable. The ground was dry and uneven, offering no clear footing. Dust would rise quickly, obscuring vision, adding confusion. The Baron understood that environment mattered as much as the animals. Panic was more effective when the senses were overwhelmed. On the morning of the event, the bulls were restless. They sensed change. Animals recognize ritual even when they do not understand it. Gates opened and closed more frequently. New smells filled the air. The presence of a crowd nearby agitated them further. They snorted, pawed the ground, slammed their weight against the barrier. The sound alone unsettled those waiting outside, a deep constant reminder of what was about to be unleashed. Handlers moved carefully, communicating with gestures rather than words. No one wanted to provoke an early charge. Each bull was guided into position with practiced caution, separated just enough to keep them from fighting one another, but close enough to ensure collective aggression. Their muscles rippled beneath their hides, tension visible even to those who tried not to look directly at them. The Baron watched from his elevated position, satisfied. This was exactly what he had envisioned. 6 living embodiments of uncontrollable force. No chains, no restraints. Once the gates were opened, he wanted to demonstrate that even without human intervention, destruction could be guaranteed. The bulls were proof that power did not always need a whip. Sometimes it needed only the right conditions. What the Baron did not consider was that aggression, no matter how carefully cultivated, still followed patterns. Bulls reacted to threat, to movement, to perceived challenge. They were not mindless. Their violence was instinctive, but not random. They responded to energy, to posture, to fear itself. These subtleties were invisible to those who saw only size and strength, but they existed all the same. As the moment approached, the bulls grew quieter, a dangerous calm settling over them. Experienced handlers knew this state well. It was the stillness before action, the moment when an animal focused completely on what lay ahead. Their breathing slowed, their heads lowered slightly. The ground beneath them seemed to hold its breath. When the gates were prepared to open, every detail had been arranged to favor the animals. There would be no distraction, no barriers once the man entered. The bulls would have full freedom of movement. The Baron wanted certainty. And 6 aggressive bulls trained to attack represented the highest form of certainty he could imagine, because in his mind nothing human could stand against that kind of force. Nothing could interrupt the outcome once those instincts were unleashed. Nothing could alter the story he had already decided would be told. because he believed violence, when multiplied and refined, became absolute, never accounting for the fact that absolute force still reacts, still.
The enclosure was built to remove hope before fear even had time to settle. Its walls were thick, reinforced with iron bands that caught the sun and reflected it harshly into the space inside. There were no corners deep enough to hide in, no gaps wide enough to slip through, no elevated ground to claim even a momentary advantage. The design was intentional. It was not meant to contain animals alone, but to trap the mind of whoever was forced inside it. From the moment the gates closed, the space communicated a single message. Nothing here was meant for survival. The ground inside was uneven, scarred by old hooves and hardened into ridges that twisted ankles and slowed movement. Dust lay thick, ready to rise at the first sign of motion and turn the air opaque. Every step would betray itself. Every shift of weight would leave a mark. Running was possible in theory, but the terrain punished speed. A man could not build rhythm there. Balance had to be earned with caution, and caution cost time. There were no tools inside the enclosure, no sticks, no stones large enough to be used as weapons, no ropes, no posts, nothing that could be repurposed into defense. The Baron had personally inspected the space to ensure that he understood that desperation made men inventive, and he wanted invention removed from the equation. Survival was not meant to depend on intelligence or resourcefulness, only on the illusion that obedience to fate might somehow soften it. The walls themselves were too smooth to climb. Any handhold that might once have existed had been deliberately worn away. Even if a man managed to get off the ground, there would be nowhere to go. The top edge curved slightly inward, a final insult to anyone who imagined escape. The enclosure was a closed sentence, written before the man ever entered it. When the enslaved man was led toward it, the guards slowed their pace. This was not kindness. It was ceremony. The Baron wanted the moment to stretch, to allow the enclosure to reveal itself fully. From the outside it already looked oppressive, but from within, it would feel smaller, tighter, more suffocating. The man was meant to see it, to measure it, to understand what it represented before being locked inside. As he crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to change. The walls trapped heat, holding it close, turning the space into something that pressed against the skin. Sound behaved differently there too. Noise echoed sharply, bounced back without distance, making even small movements feel amplified. A breath sounded louder. A footstep felt exposed. Silence became unnatural, as if the enclosure itself waited to be disturbed. The chains were removed quickly, not out of mercy but necessity. The Baron wanted no excuses, no claims that the man had been restrained unfairly. This was part of the performance. The man would face the animals as he was, unarmed and alone, but technically free to move. Freedom without options was one of the Baron's favorite contradictions. When the gates closed behind him, the sound was final. Metal struck metal with a weight that resonated through the ground. It was not a slam born of haste, but a deliberate action meant to be heard clearly by everyone watching. The locking mechanism followed, slow and precise, each turn of iron announcing that what had begun could not be reversed. Inside, the enclosure felt smaller than it looked from the outside. The walls seemed closer together, the air heavier. There was no sense of direction, no clear place to position oneself. Every spot was equally exposed. The man stood alone in a space designed to strip away orientation, to make even standing still feel like a mistake. The Baron believed this environment would do most of the work for him. Before the bulls ever entered, before horns lowered or hooves struck the ground, the enclosure itself was meant to break the man. Panic often came not from immediate danger, but from anticipation, from the mind racing ahead to outcomes it could not prevent. The enclosure was a container for that anticipation, forcing it to circulate with nowhere to escape. Witnesses could see the man clearly, which was another deliberate choice. The enclosure was positioned so that every reaction would be visible. The Baron wanted fear documented in memory. He wanted people to remember the moment the man realized how exposed he was. The enclosure turned the man into a display, a living example of what happened when power decided to demonstrate itself. What the Baron did not understand was that the same emptiness he designed to induce panic could also create focus. With no objects to distract, no routes to plan, no weapons to consider, the mind had fewer places to scatter itself. The enclosure removed complexity. It reduced the world to movement, distance, sound and presence. For someone already accustomed to reading environments for survival, this simplicity carried information rather than despair. The man felt the ground beneath his feet, tested it with small shifts of weight. He listened to how sound returned to him. He noted how his breathing echoed, how stillness changed the space. The enclosure did not give him hope, but it gave him clarity. There was nothing to wait for inside it, except what was coming, and waiting without illusions could be different from waiting in terror. From the Baron's position above, the enclosure looked perfect, a controlled space, a sealed outcome. He saw a man trapped with no tools and no exits, and believed the story was already written. In his mind, the enclosure was proof of dominance, a physical manifestation of the limits he imposed on others. He did not consider that by removing every option except presence itself, he had created a space where presence mattered more than force, where reaction would determine everything once the animals entered, where the enclosure's emptiness would magnify not just fear, but awareness, because the space that was meant to erase a man's agency had instead isolated it, concentrated it, and placed it at the center of what was about to unfold. People arrived long before the event was meant to begin, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by obligation and fear. Attendance was not optional. Overseers moved through the quarters at dawn, calling names, counting bodies, ensuring no one found an excuse to disappear. Absence itself could be interpreted as defiance. Slaves were herded into position in groups, arranged so that no one could stand apart or hide behind others. The Baron wanted faces visible. He wanted eyes forward. Witnesses were as important as the act itself. Free men gathered as well, though they stood farther back, clustered together with forced confidence. Some came because the Baron had invited them, others because refusing an invitation carried its own risks. They told themselves they were there as observers, not participants, as if distance could absolve them. Conversations were quiet, clipped, filled with nervous laughter that faded quickly. No one spoke about what they expected to see, but everyone imagined it vividly. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. It pressed down on the crowd, slowed movement, altered breathing. Even children sensed something unnatural and were pulled close by their mothers, though no effort was made to shield them completely. The Baron believed early exposure to fear taught obedience more effectively than lessons delivered later. Suffering, when normalized young, became part of the world rather than something to question. People positioned themselves carefully. Slaves avoided the front if possible, knowing visibility meant vulnerability. Free men chose spots that offered a clear view without appearing too eager. Overseers stood rigidly, performing authority even as tension tightened their jaws. Everyone understood that this was not just about the man in the enclosure. It was about reaffirming the order that governed all of them. As time stretched, silence grew heavy. The enclosure sat empty at first, a stark shape against the ground. Its presence alone commanded attention. People stared at it the way one stares at a wound before it opens, unable to look away. The absence of action heightened the imagination. Each person filled the quiet with their own version of what would happen once the gates opened. When the enslaved man was finally brought out, the shift in energy was immediate. Bodies leaned forward without realizing it. Conversations stopped entirely. The man became the focal point of every thought, every breath. Some recognized him, others did not. Those who did felt a sharper fear, because familiarity made the danger real rather than abstract. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. He was led slowly, deliberately, giving the crowd time to study him. The Baron wanted reactions. He wanted fear to ripple outward. Some slaves lowered their eyes, unable to watch. Others stared despite themselves, compelled by a mixture of dread and something close to hope, though they did not yet know why. Free men watched with guarded expressions, measuring the man's posture, his face, looking for signs of terror that would reassure them the world still made sense. The man did not perform fear the way many expected. He did not struggle. He did not collapse. This unsettled the crowd more than screaming would have. Fear was easier to process when it followed familiar patterns. Calm introduced uncertainty. Whispers began to move through the gathered slaves, quickly silenced by overseers' glares. But the tension remained. When he entered the enclosure and the gates closed behind him, a murmur rippled through the crowd, a low sound made of breath rather than voice. The finality of the sound struck everyone at once. Some flinched as if the metal had closed around them personally. The enclosure no longer felt like a structure. It felt like a verdict. The Baron took his position, elevated and visible, ensuring that attention shifted briefly to him. This was his stage, and he wanted acknowledgement. The crowd's gaze moved back and forth between him and the enclosure, reinforcing the connection between authority and consequence. He allowed the moment to linger, savoring the collective discomfort. Control was sweetest when it was felt rather than announced. As the bulls were prepared out of sight, the waiting became almost unbearable. People shifted their weight, adjusted their stance,
wiped sweat from their faces. The heat, the dust, the proximity of so many bodies intensified everything. The Baron did not hurry. He understood that fear deepened when delayed. Anticipation hollowed people out, leaving them raw. Some in the crowd began to imagine the outcome so vividly that their bodies reacted as if it were already happening. Hands clenched, stomachs tight. A few turned away, unable to maintain the image forming in their minds. Others forced themselves to watch, believing that witnessing suffering was safer than being singled out for avoid. When the first sounds of the bulls reached the crowd, low and distant, a wave of unease passed through everyone present. Even those who had come expecting violence were unprepared for how real it suddenly felt. This was no longer a story or a threat. It was imminent. Children whimpered softly before being hushed. Adults swallowed hard, eyes fixed forward. The Baron watched the crowd as closely as he watched the enclosure. Their reactions mattered to him. Fear was contagious, and he wanted it spread evenly. Each person who trembled reinforced his belief that power was intact. He did not see individuals anymore, only a mass responding exactly as he intended. What the crowd did not realize was that their presence gave the moment weight beyond cruelty. Witnesses transformed violence into memory, memory into warning. The Baron depended on that transformation. Without witnesses, the act would have ended when the blood dried. With witnesses, it would live on, retold and reshaped, a permanent fixture in the landscape of. As the gates holding the bulls were prepared, the crowd leaned forward again, drawn by instinct. Despite every impulse to flee, no one moved. No one dared break the spell. The space between the enclosure and the spectators felt charged, as if something invisible stretched taut between them. Everyone understood that what they were about to see would not belong only to the man inside, but to all of them, that the moment would mark them, follow them back to their lives, settle into their thoughts at night, altering how they spoke, how they obeyed, how they imagined survival itself. Because witnessing a death designed as spectacle was meant to remind them that power was not content with control alone, that it demanded acknowledgement, participation, and memory, binding everyone present into the event whether they wanted it or not. When the man stood inside the enclosure, what struck observers first was not what he did, but what he did not do. He did not pace. He did not press himself against the walls. He did not search frantically for weak points, or shout toward the crowd. His stillness contrasted sharply with the tension rippling through everyone watching. In a place designed to provoke panic, he remained measured, as if panic were a language he had already learned to ignore. His breathing was slow and deliberate. Each inhale seemed intentional, each exhale controlled. This alone unsettled the overseers, who were accustomed to watching fear take hold quickly. Most men placed in such circumstances began to unravel even before the danger appeared. Their bodies betrayed them through trembling hands, darting eyes, erratic movement. The Baron expected this unraveling. He relied on it. Fear was supposed to announce itself loudly, but the man's body told a different story. His shoulders were loose, not slumped in defeat, not squared in defiance. His weight shifted occasionally, not restlessly, but as if he were testing the ground, learning it. These small movements suggested awareness rather than desperation. To the trained eye, it looked like preparation, though no one present was prepared to interpret it that way. From the crowd, whispers began to stir, quickly suppressed but impossible to erase entirely. Calm was not supposed to exist here. Calm disrupted the narrative. The spectacle depended on visible terror to validate its purpose. Without it, the meaning of the event began to blur, and that ambiguity made people uncomfortable. The Baron noticed it too. From his elevated position, he leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. He had seen men attempt bravery before, but it never lasted. Fear always claimed its due. He told himself this was no different, that the calm was temporary, a fragile mask that would shatter the moment the bulls entered. Still, a trace of irritation crept in. The man was not behaving correctly. Inside the enclosure, the man listened. He did not focus on the crowd, whose presence he felt without needing to see. He listened instead to the space itself, to how sound moved, to how silence settled. He paid attention to his own body, noting the absence of panic rather than congratulating himself for it. He had learned long ago that fear fed on attention. Naming it gave it power. Ignoring it weakened its grip. His calm was not born of confidence in survival. It was born of acceptance. Years under the Baron's rule had taught him that struggling against inevitability wasted energy. What mattered was how one met what came next. Panic scattered the mind. Calm gathered it. He chose gathering. As minutes passed, the contrast grew sharp. The crowd grew restless while the man remained still. Overseers shifted, hands tightening on weapons they would not use. Free men exchanged uneasy glances. The spectacle had paused in an unexpected way, and no one knew how to react to it. The calm began to take on weight. It was no longer simply the absence of fear. It felt active, deliberate. Some in the crowd began to feel it reflect back at them, making them aware of their own tension. The man inside the enclosure seemed separate from the emotional storm surrounding him, and that separation created a strange imbalance. He was supposed to be the most afraid person present. Instead, fear appeared to be everywhere else. The Baron attempted to reclaim control by shifting attention back to himself. But the man's presence continued to draw the eye. It was difficult to look away from someone who refused to perform terror when terror was demanded. The Baron's authority relied on predictability. This calm introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. Inside the enclosure, the man closed his eyes briefly, not in prayer but in focus. He centered himself, grounding his awareness in his breath, his stance, the feel of the earth beneath his feet. He did not imagine the bull. He did not imagine pain. He stayed with what was real and immediate. The present moment was manageable. The future was not worth visiting yet. When distant sounds of the bulls reached the enclosure, low and heavy, a murmur rose from the crowd. This was usually the point where men broke. The anticipation sharpened, fear rushing in to fill the space before violence arrived. But the man opened his eyes calmly, his expression unchanged. He did not flinch. He adjusted his footing slightly, aligning his body with the sounds rather than recoiling from them. That adjustment did not go unnoticed. A few watchers felt a flicker of confusion. This was not the posture of surrender, nor was it aggression. It was something else, something quieter and harder to name. It suggested readiness without resistance, awareness without challenge. The Baron felt a tightening in his chest, a sensation he did not recognize immediately as unease. He told himself that calm meant nothing, that animals would not care about posture or breath, or stillness. Bulls responded to movement, to threat, to instinct, and instinct would do the work he intended it to do. Still, his gaze remained fixed on the man, waiting for the inevitable crack to appear. The calm endured. It stretched the moment thin, almost to the point of breaking. Time felt distorted. Seconds lengthened. Every breath in the enclosure seemed amplified by the waiting. The man's calm began to feel defiant. Though it was never expressed as such, it was simply present, unyielding, refusing to give the spectacle what it demanded. For the slaves watching, something subtle began to They had been trained to see calm in such moments as foolishness, as denial. Yet this calm did not look foolish. It looked grounded. Some felt a stir of something unfamiliar, a quiet recognition that fear was not the only possible response to power. They did not yet know what that meant, only that they were witnessing something rare. As the gates holding the bulls were prepared, the man remained steady. His focus narrowed further. He tuned out the crowd entirely now. The Baron, the noise beyond the enclosure. His world reduced itself to space, sound and movement. Calm became not just an emotional state, but a tool, a way of engaging with what was coming without being consumed by it. The Baron raised his hand, signaling that the next phase would begin. He expected at that moment to see panic finally surface, a last realization of doom, reflected on the man's face. He saw none. The man stood ready, not resigned, not pleading, not raging, but present in a way that unsettled the very structure of the spectacle. Because calm in the face of designed terror threatened to expose a truth the Baron had spent his life denying, that fear was not absolute, that control was not guaranteed, that even in the most carefully constructed cage, the human response.
When the bulls finally entered the enclosure, the man did not retreat. That alone broke an unspoken rule, everyone believed to be fixed. Men were expected to move away from danger, to flee, to run until the body failed. The man did none of that. He remained where he was, adjusting only enough to face what approached him. His movements were slow, deliberate, stripped of urgency. There was no sudden shift, no signal of challenge or surrender, only presence. As the first bull stepped forward, massive and coiled with tension, the man did something that seemed impossibly foolish to the crowd. He lifted his head and met the animal's eyes, not with defiance, not with fear, but with attention. His gaze was steady, unblinking, grounded. To most watching, it looked like madness. Eye contact with an aggressive animal was thought to invite attack. Everyone expected the charge to come instantly. It did not. The bull snorted, stamping once, its head lowering slightly. Dust rose around its hoof. The animal was accustomed to panic, to erratic motion, to men who screamed or ran or flailed. What stood before it now did none of those things. The man's stillness created a pause, a moment where instinct had no familiar cue to follow. The man shifted his weight subtly, not backward, not forward, but into balance. His shoulders remained relaxed, his arms hung loosely at his sides, visible and open, not raised in threat. His breathing stayed slow, almost synchronized with the space between movement. He did not stare aggressively, but he did not look away either. He allowed the bull to see him fully, without tension amplifying the encounter. The second bull moved closer, drawn by the first's hesitation. The crowd reacted with a sharp intake of breath. Two bulls now stood within striking distance. Any second, they thought, the illusion would shatter, panic would erupt. But the man did not change his posture. He adjusted his stance slightly, angling his body rather than squaring himself directly. It was a subtle gesture, one that suggested awareness of space, rather than confrontation. The bulls responded to this in ways no one had predicted. Instead of charging, they slowed. Their movements became cautious. Heads lifted slightly. The rhythm of the encounter changed. It was no longer a collision waiting to happen. It became a negotiation of presence. The man maintained eye contact selectively. He did not lock his gaze onto one animal to the exclusion of the other. He let his attention move calmly between them, acknowledging each without singling anyone out as an enemy. This distributed focus mattered. Predators and prey both read fixation as threat. The man offered neither fixation nor fear. As more bulls entered the enclosure, the space filled with massive bodies and tension thickened, but the pattern held. The man did not back himself into a corner. He did not attempt to dominate. He stood where he was, letting the animals circle, adjusting only to maintain balance and visibility. Each small movement was smooth, measured, never abrupt. Suddenness provoked instinct. Smoothness interrupted it. From the Baron's vantage point, confusion crept in. This was not how aggression was supposed to unfold. Bulls were meant to charge. Violence was meant to escalate. Instead, there was a strange stillness inside the enclosure, broken only by heavy breathing and the occasional scrape of hooves against earth. The spectacle was slipping out of the shape he had designed. The man's eye contact remained the center of it all, not staring down, not challenging, but communicating presence. Animals, especially ones trained to react, still read energy before action. The man's energy was steady. There was no spike, no signal of threat. He was not trying to control the bull. He was allowing them to see him without fear amplifying the interaction. One bull turned its head slightly, breaking eye contact first. The crowd noticed. Murmurs rippled despite attempts to suppress them. This was impossible. Bulls did not look away. Not like the man did not pursue the moment. He did not move toward the bull that turned away. He let it go, maintaining his calm stance with the others. This restraint mattered. Had he advanced, the fragile balance might have shattered. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, breathing evenly, posture unchanged. The bulls continued to circle, but their movements lacked the violence everyone expected. The energy inside the enclosure shifted from explosive to wary. The man adjusted again, aligning his body slightly sideways, reducing his profile without shrinking himself. This made him less confrontational without making him vulnerable. It was an instinctive choice, born not of training but of deep observation learned through years of surviving power dynamics far more complex than animal behavior. He understood something the Baron never had, that confrontation escalates when fear meets fear, and dissolves when fear finds nothing to mirror. The Baron's irritation deepened into something closer to alarm. He had not planned for hesitation. He had not planned for animals to sleep. The entire logic of the punishment relied on inevitability. Without it, the demonstration of power began to fracture. He leaned forward, jaw tight, willing the bulls to do what they were meant to do. Inside the enclosure, the man felt the shift as clearly as any. He sensed the bulls' uncertainty, the way their aggression searched for a trigger and found none. He did not relax further. He did not celebrate internally. He stayed exactly as he was, understanding that balance could be broken by the smallest mistake. Calm was not passive, it was active, maintained moment by moment. The bulls' breathing slowed. Their movements became less erratic. They responded to the man's steady presence by matching it unconsciously. Energy mirrored energy. Where chaos was expected, order began to emerge, not imposed but reflect. The crowd struggled to understand what they were seeing. This was not resistance. This was not obedience. It was something quieter, something that did not fit into the language of punishment or power. The man was not overpowering the bulls. He was not submitting to. He was meeting them in a space that denied the spectacle its violence. The Baron felt control slipping, not dramatically, but subtly, which was worse. A sudden failure could be punished, explained away. This slow unraveling of certainty could not. The man's eye contact, his slow movement, his refusal to panic were rewriting the meaning of the enclosure in real time, turning a stage of terror into something unpredictable, something alive, because the moment fear failed to appear where it was demanded, the entire structure of authority built around it began to reveal its fragility. And the bulls, trained for aggression but still governed by instinct, responded not to expectation, but to what stood before them, a man who did not offer fear as fuel, a presence that interrupted the very reaction the Baron had believed was guaranteed. As the encounter continued, the man's understanding of the bulls became more apparent, though invisible to the Baron and the crowd. He did not merely stand, he observed. Each movement, each shift of weight, each subtle motion of head or hoof, was noted, and processed instinctively. His eyes scanned continuously, not frantically, but with a quiet precision that allowed him to anticipate without predicting, to adapt without reacting in haste. Every detail informed the next choice, every nuance held significance. The bulls were trained to attack, yet their instincts were not mechanical. They responded to signals in the environment, to energy and posture as much as to sound or sight. The man recognized this without needing to articulate. He understood that aggression followed patterns, simple ones at first, then more complex when tension increased. By remaining calm, he provided no pattern to exploit, no cue to trigger instinctive response. Their training assumed fear as the natural human reaction, but he refused that script. He shifted slightly, repositioning himself as the animals moved around him. The adjustments were subtle, weight distributed differently, a small pivot of the foot, a relaxation of a shoulder, but each action communicated control over his own presence. The bulls reacted, pausing or redirecting, sensing the lack of threat in a body that did not radiate panic. It was not dominance in the human sense, but an alignment with the energy around him, a harmonization that defied expectation. Observers could see the effects, though few understood them. Where there should have been chaos, there was hesitation. Where movement should have provoked aggression, there was a slowing of pace. Witnesses whispered, uncertain whether their eyes deceived them. The bulls were supposed to be instruments of destruction, but their behavior no longer followed the script written by the Baron. The spectacle was fracturing, and the man's calm was at its center. The Baron grew increasingly tense. He had calculated every detail, believed he controlled every variable. 6 aggressive bulls, an empty enclosure, and one man. He had assumed the outcome was predetermined, yet what unfolded was something he could not command. He leaned forward, muscles tight, searching for the moment where fear would erupt, where instinct would claim what was promised. That moment never came. The man's presence altered the energy in the space, redirecting it subtly, but irrevocably. Inside the enclosure, the man's mind was he did not fight the situation. He did not attempt to manipulate the bulls. He did not resist in a way that would provoke violence. He simply maintained awareness, adjusting posture, stance, and breathing to match the shifting dynamics. Calm was not passive, it was active, requiring continuous observation and micro-adjustments. Every movement was purposeful, measured, and intentional, executed with the precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on understanding more than brute force. As the bulls circled, some began to mirror his movements unconsciously. Their initial aggression, trained into them from years of conditioning, had been triggered by instinctual cues, panic, erratic motion, energy projected in fear. That energy was absent. The animals paused, tested and retreated slightly, not fully aware why, only sensing a discrepancy between expectation and reality. The man's stillness created a space where aggression became optional rather than inevitable. He shifted his gaze carefully, scanning each animal as it moved, acknowledging presence without projecting challenge. The bulls adjusted their paths subtly, their bodies reading signals too small for the crowd to interpret. Each subtle nod of the head, turn of the body, or repositioning of the feet, maintained balance, without escalating the situation. He did not dominate, he did not submit, he simply existed in alignment with the energy of the space. The crowd's reaction shifted as what had begun as anticipation of violence transformed into disbelief. Eyes widened, breaths caught, whispers spread, attempting to make sense of what they saw. The man's calm unsettled them as much as the threat of the bulls. People expected panic, and when it failed to appear, the order of the world itself seemed uncertain. The spectacle had lost its intended effect. Fear was no longer the defining feature.
The Baron's frustration increased with each passing sec. He could not intervene without ruining the performance. He had relied on inevitability, on predictable aggression, on the assumption that the enclosure, the animals and the circumstances would guarantee outcome. None of these assumptions accounted for a human mind operating with complete presence and unwavering calm. He leaned forward, silent, tension coiling through him, watching as the man continued to defy expectation. Inside the enclosure, the man adjusted again, weight shifting slightly to maintain balance. As the bull's paths intersected, he allowed his presence to be felt without threatening it. There was no sudden jerk, no movement to start. The bulls responded by moving around him, testing his stability, reading the subtle energy he projected. This delicate interaction, though invisible to most observers, was the key to what followed. Aggression without response fades. Instinct without confirmation dissipates. The man had created a neutral field, and the bulls were operating within it. His breathing remained steady. His shoulders stayed relaxed, eyes unblinking. He processed every subtle movement, adjusting micro-moments at a time. Every inch of ground he occupied was intentional. He was not trying to command. He was maintaining equilibrium, which in this unnatural scenario acted as command. The bulls sensed this equilibrium, responding instinctively to the energy shift without conscious thought. The crowd began to realize something extraordinary. The anticipated chaos, the violent climax, the demonstration of dominance. None had arrived. Observers began to question their assumptions. Fear, which had been the tool of the Baron's control, was now destabilized by the man's calm. Whispers grew, but they were quickly stifled by the overseers. Though the tension had already spread, the spectacle designed to consolidate authority had inadvertently become a demonstration of control over perception itself. The man's calm was not invulnerability, but strategy in its purest form. He did not fight the animals. He did not flee. He did not panic. Instead, he existed as a steady presence, a center around which instinct itself had to orient. The bulls moved differently because of him, not because he coerced them, not because he intimidated them, but because he offered no energy to provoke their trained aggression. This was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet transformative. Time stretched, seconds became minutes. The crowd, the Baron, the overseers, all waited for the expected, yet it did not arrive. The man's calm reshaped the environment, altering the natural response of the animals and the psychology of everyone present. The intended narrative of violence was replaced by a quiet negotiation between presence and instinct, observation and reaction, awareness and anticipation, a dynamic that no one had considered possible, and one that could not be undone simply by authority or threat, because the man had learned to exist in the moment, fully, with clarity, and that clarity turned expectation into uncertainty. As the bulls continued to circle, the crowd became aware of a subtle shift in the enclosure that none of them had anticipated. The man's presence was no longer simply calm. It had begun to influence the behavior of the animal. The first few minutes had been tense, filled with cautious movements and nervous snorts, but now the bulls moved differently. Their aggression, once automatic and sharp, became hesitant, uncertain, as if the invisible rules they had always followed were suddenly in question. This hesitation did not come from training nor from obedience. It came from instinct responding to something it could not categorize. The man adjusted his stance again, shifting weight slightly from one foot to the other, not in panic, not in challenge, but in perfect balance with the space around him. His movements were so small, so deliberate, that they almost seemed imperceptible, yet they carried a presence the bulls could sense. Animals respond not only to overt threats, but also to energy, posture and rhythm. His energy was steady, even consistent, offering no spikes of fear or aggression for the bulls to react to. The effect was immediate. The first bull paused mid-step, its head raised slightly, nostrils flaring as it re-evaluated its target. The others mirrored the hesitation, their paths adjusting subtly to avoid direct confrontation. The crowd noticed the pause and murmured among themselves, though fear still kept most voices subdued. Some slaves whispered incredulously, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught to expect. Free men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another with disbelief. Even the Baron's expression tightened as he leaned forward, realizing that his carefully constructed spectacle was slipping out of his control. The enclosure, the bulls, the anticipation, all had been intended to demonstrate absolute dominance. Yet here was a man whose calmness altered everything, rendering instinct unreliable and expectation meaningless. Inside the enclosure, the man's focus remained unwavering. He did not look to the Baron or the crowd. He did not measure his success in the reactions of others. His awareness was entirely on the bulls and the space they occupied together. He read their subtle movements, the flick of an ear, the shift in weight, the slight adjustment of a hoof, and responded with micro-movements that maintained balance and presence. This required immense concentration, as any abrupt motion could provoke a charge, but each adjustment was intentional, almost imperceptible, a dialogue conducted without sound or overt gesture. The bulls' reactions continued to change. What had begun as raw aggression now became a hesitant investigation. Their instinctual drive to attack was being moderated by a presence they could not interpret. The man was not threatening, yet he was not retreating. He occupied the space fully, and that completeness disrupted the patterns they had been trained to follow. Their instincts were confused, responding to energy and intention rather than fear, and the balance they had always assumed in the enclosure began to shift subtly toward him. Observers struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. Where there should have been chaos, there was calculation. Where there should have been panic, there was control. The spectacle had been designed to demonstrate dominance through fear, yet the man's calm had introduced a new dynamic, one in which presence outweighed aggression, awareness countered instinct, and stillness challenged expectation. Whispers grew in volume despite attempts to suppress them, as people instinctively understood that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. The Baron's irritation transformed into alarm. He had counted on inevitability, on the predictable response of both the animals and the man. But the predictability had evaporated. He leaned forward, jaw tight, hands gripping the railing, attempting mentally to restore control. Authority relies on certainty, and the absence of it created unease. The man inside the enclosure was rewriting the rules in real time, defying not just the Baron's expectations, but the very assumptions underpinning the entire demonstration of power. The man shifted slightly again, moving in rhythm with the bulls rather than against them. His posture remained relaxed yet deliberate. He did not attempt to dominate or intimidate. He merely existed in a balanced, responsive state. This subtle harmony with the animals created a feedback loop. The bulls, trained for aggression, found no confirmation of threat. Their energy moderated. The crowd could sense the change without understanding it. Where they expected violence, they now observed a strange negotiation, almost imperceptible, unfolding in real time between man and beast. The man's breathing remained steady, synchronized with his micro-adjustment. Each inhale and exhale was calm, unhurried, projecting a continuity of presence that the bulls could register instinctively. Animals respond to rhythm, and his consistent, deliberate rhythm acted as a stabilizing force. Aggression relies on disruption, on a spike of energy to trigger response, and in the absence of that disruption, instinct paused. The bulls did not attack, they observed, they adjusted, they followed. What the Baron had designed as an inescapable scenario became a demonstration of something entirely different. Influence through calm, authority without threat. Time stretched unnaturally inside the enclosure. Seconds became minutes. The man continued his subtle shifts, micro-adjustments that were almost imperceptible, yet completely effective. The bulls followed, circling, pausing, testing, but never committing to a charge. The man's presence acted as a fulcrum, balancing the energy in the He did not command them, he did not speak, and he did not intimidate, but his calm, attentive presence rewrote the expected outcome. The crowd could see it, but they could not explain it. The anticipated spectacle of destruction had dissolved into something unrecognizable and unsettling. The Baron's frustration became visible to everyone watching. He had relied on every element being predictable, from the enclosure's design to the bull's training. Yet nothing had gone according to plan. His authority depended on fear being demonstrated publicly, on violence confirming control. Yet the man had subverted this through presence alone. Panic, expectation, instinct, all had been neutralized by calm. The enclosure, intended as a stage for dominance, had become a theater of observation, of interaction, and of quiet command over the unpredictable. Inside the enclosure, the man adjusted yet again, sensing the bulls' positions, anticipating their movements before they occurred, not through force or dominance, but through attentive awareness. Each step, each weight shift, each subtle gesture maintained equilibrium. He did not challenge the animals, but he did not yield. This balance created uncertainty in the bulls' instincts. Their aggression was trained, but it was not absolute. Energy without confirmation falters. Presence without fear redirects instinct. The man had discovered this truth through years of observing power, violence, and survival under conditions far more complex than this moment, and he applied it instinctively in real time. The crowd began to sense that the event was no longer under control. Whispers grew loud. Gasps punctuated the tense silence. The spectacle, intended to demonstrate dominance, had transformed into a demonstration of presence, awareness, and control. Without violence, fear had failed to manifest where it was expected. Authority had been challenged not by rebellion or strength, but by clarity, calm, and the quiet mastery of a single individual, standing fully present in a space designed to destroy him, creating a dynamic that defied expectation.
As the moment stretched on, the tension inside the enclosure reached a new dimension, one that none of the spectators had anticipated. The bulls, 6 of them, massive and trained for aggression, had yet to charge. The man remained steady, his posture calm, measured and deliberate, absorbing the full force of what was coming at him without yielding. This was a state that required more than courage. It required acute awareness, intuition honed by experience, and an understanding of instinct far beyond the ordinary. Every fiber of his body was attuned to movement, to the subtleties of threat, to the rhythm of the animal's approach. The first bull lowered its head slightly, and pawed at the ground, nostrils flaring. Yet it did not rush. Its companions mirrored the hesitation, following instinct, but uncertain of the signals they were receiving. Aggression in animals, even trained aggression, is a conversation of energy. The man did not emit fear or challenge. He simply existed, perfectly balanced. His calm became a force in itself, a presence that subtly altered the behavior of the bulls, disarming what had been considered inevitable. The crowd watched in disbelief, as the anticipated carnage failed to materialize, their expectations pastured by the simplest of human acts, presence. Inside the enclosure, the man's movements were almost imperceptible, yet each adjustment was critical. He shifted weight slightly from one foot to the other, rotated his shoulders just enough to maintain balance, and adjusted the position of his arms in response to the animal's proximity. These micro-adjustments required extraordinary focus. Any sudden or exaggerated motion could provoke a charge, yet his subtlety created a strange equilibrium. The bulls could sense motion, energy and intention, and in the absence of fear or challenge, their aggression faltered. The Baron, observing from his elevated perch, became increasingly agitated. He had meticulously calculated every aspect of the event, the enclosure, the selection of bulls, the anticipated terror of the man inside. He expected spectacle and domination, yet here was an anomaly that defied all logic. The man's calm, deliberate presence had introduced uncertainty into a scenario designed for absolute predictability. Authority depends on control, and the absence of predictable outcomes eroded that control. The Baron's jaw tightened, and a shadow of fear crossed his features. Fear not for himself, but for the collapse of the narrative he had constructed. The man's gaze shifted smoothly between the bulls, registering subtle movements in each, the flick of an ear, the flex of a hoof, the tightening of a muscle. He did not challenge, did not retreat, did not hesitate. He was fully present, reading the animal's instincts, and responding not with force but with stillness, with calm, with an awareness that dictated the tempo of the encounter. Each bull's hesitation fed into the others, creating a collective pause. Trained aggression relies on momentum, on the assumption that targets will panic and flee. Without that panic, the cycle is broken, and that is precisely what the man achieved. The spectators began to feel the tension in a new way. Where they expected violent action, they found themselves confronted with a different kind of power, controlled awareness. Whispers moved through the crowd, growing in volume as disbelief mounted. Some slaves, who had expected death to arrive swiftly, now sensed that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a demonstration not of brute force, but of the capacity for human presence to shape outcomes even in the face of overwhelming danger. Free men shifted uneasily, unsure whether to respect or fear what they were seeing, their assumptions about dominance and submission unraveling with every passing second. The man adjusted again, moving with precision and economy. His micro-movements maintained his balance and spatial awareness, while projecting an energy of calm assurance. He did not provoke the bulls, but he did not yield. Each bull's decision-making was influenced by his presence. One lifted its head, sniffed the air, and paused. Another tested the ground and circled slightly away. A third shifted its weight in minor hesitation. These small actions, almost invisible to the untrained eye, represented a radical shift in the encounter. The environment designed to enforce fear and submission now became a stage where awareness dictated the terms of engagement. The Baron's frustration reached a critical point. Every element had been designed to assert control through terror, yet the man's calmness nullified the intended effect. Authority relies on predictable reactions, and unpredictability weakens it. The Baron leaned forward, hands gripping the railing, as he tried to anticipate the outcome, realizing that he had underestimated the subtle power of presence. The entire structure he had built, the enclosure, the bulls, the expectation of panic, was being reshaped by one man's mastery over his own awareness and energy. Inside the enclosure, the man continued to move subtly, responding to the bull's minor adjustments, maintaining equilibrium without initiating conflict. Each breath was deliberate, measured and unhurried, creating a rhythm that the bulls could sense instinctively. Animals respond to consistent energy and clear signals, and the absence of fear or sudden motion gave the man an unspoken control over the dynamics of the space. His calm acted like a counterweight, a stabilizing force against the momentum of aggression. The crowd watched in silent awe as the encounter unfolded. What had been expected to be a display of terror and dominance transformed into a demonstration of human presence and intelligence. Observers were forced to reevaluate their assumptions about strength, control, and survival. The man's calm was not a passive state. It was a deliberate strategy, executed with precision and awareness. Every micro-adjustment, every controlled breath, every subtle gaze contributed to a dynamic that none of the spectators had ever witnessed before. The bull's behavior continued to reflect the man's presence. Initial aggression gave way to caution. Each movement was measured, hesitant, as if the animals themselves were questioning what they were being asked to do. Trained instinct met with unpredictable calm, and in that meeting, the narrative shifted. Where violence was expected, awareness dominated. Where fear was anticipated, observation ruled. The man's presence altered not only the bull's behavior, but also the psychology of everyone witnessing the event. As the minutes passed, the man maintained this delicate equilibrium. His focus never wavered. He adjusted subtly to maintain distance, to keep the bulls circling without provoking attack, and to remain fully aware of the spatial dynamics inside the enclosure. Each action was purposeful. He neither challenged nor submitted. He simply existed fully within the moment, mastering the environment through awareness, calm, and presence. This was not a simple act of courage. It was a disciplined, intuitive negotiation with instinct itself, a demonstration that control can exist beyond force, that survival can depend on perception, timing, and the mastery of oneself, and that even in the face of overwhelming danger, clarity and calm can shape outcomes in ways that brute strength cannot. Because the space designed to instill fear had become a stage where the quiet precision of one man's presence dictated the rhythm of life and death, reshaping instinct, perception, and expectation in real time. The climax of this harrowing encounter came not with violence, but with revelation. The man who had been expected to crumble under fear and force emerged not broken but masterful of the moment. Each of the 6 bulls, trained to kill, had been neutralized not by strength or weapons but by the unwavering calm, awareness, and presence of a single human being. The crowd, slaves, overseers, and freemen alike, watched in stunned silence, as what was meant to be a display of terror transformed into a lesson in resilience, control, and the extraordinary power of presence. In that enclosure, it became clear that true mastery over danger did not require domination or violence. It required understanding, focus, and the courage to exist fully in the moment, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Fear, once assumed to be absolute, had been rendered powerless by patience and perception. The man had survived not by brute force, but by a rare clarity that allowed instinct to work with him, rather than against him, turning aggression into hesitation, chaos into equilibrium, and a stage of cruelty into a testament of human ingenuity. The Baron's authority, once unquestionable, now seemed fragile. The spectacle he had designed to enforce fear had backfired, exposing the limits of control and the unpredictable power of the human spirit. Witnesses carried the lesson silently. Power is not absolute, and even in the direst circumstances, awareness, courage, and calm can turn the impossible into reality. As the gates finally opened and the man stepped out of the enclosure, every eye followed him, not in expectation of punishment, but in recognition of something greater. He had not just survived, he had rewritten what survival could mean. In that moment, the story became eternal. A single man, facing insurmountable odds, transformed fear into mastery, danger into clarity, and left behind a truth that would echo far beyond the walls of the enclosure.